Hey everyone, Carmen here, digital editor at Ms. with Dr. Irma McClaurin. Hey, great to talk to you today.
Good to be here.
And I'm really excited to talk to you about all the different things that you are doing and have done. And you've just had such a rich academic life and also such a rich media life and worked in feminist media in so many different ways. And I'm just curious, we've been exploring in all of my different conversations with the scholars sort of the way activism, academia, media sort of all fuel each other and support one another. And I'm curious as to what your journey has been like and how those things have all fit together for you.
I would say first, I think I began to see academic life through the lens of a performer because my first degree is in creative writing and literature. So I've been used to performing poetry since I was like in the first and second grade. And as I started thinking about my work in administration, particularly admissions, I'm like, this is a performance, you know? And so it was easy to make that translation. And then as I moved into, and actually when I worked as an assistant dean and I would give presentations to parents, I would always incorporate poetry or something into it. So in that way, I was still building on that. And then the writing has been a very important part. Even though I wasn't doing creative writing, I was able to be creative with the kind of writing that I was doing, admissions brochures and, you know, just taking general ideas, newsletters, and coming up with interesting and fun ways. So I found a way to blend the two. And then later moving out into the world, I've always done reviews or talked about the arts, and I've found articles that I wrote about like the Los Papinas, the Cuban troubadours in the 1980s. So it's been for me a journey, but there's been a kind of continuity throughout all of that. And now I'm actually a Twitter person. I love tweeting, even though it's been taken over. But I like it much more than Facebook. There's something about that kind of succinctness that really captures my attention. And the interesting thing is that I've met all kinds of cool people through it. So there's a hashtag Cite Black Women, and I picked up one of their badges, so I'm wearing it here. And then I get a text today from someone who says, I'm the person from hashtag Cite Black Women. So I'm making connections. I've made connections with feminist scholars, Black feminist scholars through Twitter. And so it's become a communications thing. And I would say that more than anything, particularly for feminists, I think the work that Ms. has done, you know, in integrating women's studies content into the magazine was, to me, probably the most, you know, memorable kind of thing. And I was just glad to be a part of that.
Yes, and I wanted to talk to you about that you were an instrumental part of the grants that allowed us to start doing Ms. Writers workshops with scholars and sort of helping scholars learn how to write for the popular press and how to write for different audiences and sort of how to make their work more accessible. And so you've been able to also see the impact of that.
Yes.
And what do you think does happen with public scholarship? What have you seen, and what do you think the potential is there?
Well, I think it has certainly become more legitimized, and it was something that I've always done. So as I moved from an MFA into a social science, the way that I write anthropology is very much informed by my creative writing. And so my professors were always saying, well, how do you write like that? And I'm like, well, I don't know if I can explain it. I just know it when I see it, right? But I also do teach writing. And I remember the conversation with Ellie, and she said, well, you know, we're doing this, but women journalists are a little reluctant to sort of write for us sometimes. They don't want to be typecast, and you can understand that. And I said, well, if you can't find them, why don't you grow them? And that planted the seeds for the workshop. And so that's been very powerful because for myself as a scholar, what I found was that it gave me a voice that I could not necessarily have in more formal academic journals. It also was a quick turnaround, so I could see, like the blog I wrote on sexual harassment, boom, it was up in the afternoon. And that kind of quick response, I think, is something that scholars don't often see. And then that actual article led to me being on a show, ABC 7 Here and Now, with Sandra Bookman, and she used that as the platform for doing an interview with me on big stage ABC 7. So I think, that never would have happened with an academic journal. So I think Writing has, there are many different kinds of writing, and they all have their purpose. But this kind of public writing, I think, is increasingly becoming something that you're seeing in sciences. There are actually now programs called public science writing. We're seeing it in the social science. We're seeing it actually in grant proposals where funders are saying, what is your broad social impact? And they want you to write in non-jargon language. So I think that the work that Ms. is doing is actually putting feminist scholars ahead of the trend. And increasingly, institutions are now using public writing as the criteria for tenure, that it's okay to do that kind of writing and it's being legitimized in that way. I think the challenge is that we have to make sure that when you start institutionalizing and legitimizing things within these kinds of institutions, it has a tendency to sometimes be co-opted. And so I think Ms., because it's always held itself as a standard bearer for independent thinking, and the fact that it now doesn't have to rely on ads and things like that, that it actually is the perfect vehicle for this kind of as an outlet for this kind of scholarship and this kind of writing. And I think it is a form of scholarship.
Awesome. And sort of outside of the academy, what has been the impact that you've witnessed in that larger media landscape too? I feel like it's interesting to know that women journalists didn't want to be typecast, because I feel like now being a feminist journalist is a little bit more normalized, a little bit more common.
Yes.
Do you feel like the work that scholars are doing with Ms. is also sort of changing the media landscape as well?
Well, I think in the same way that social media has democratized who gets to speak, it's given access, sometimes too much access that some people want not to be given access, and we won't name anybody. But I think it has given access, and in some ways it's made journalists be more conscious of how they write and what they write about. They're now picking up on things, and I think in some ways we're inspiring them, because the lens through which we see the world, we're looking at it built on this foundation, this bedrock of scholarship, where we can do a deep dive, and I think they're beginning to take notice. And I would say that the kind of writing we're doing is actually influencing. So journalistic programs are now doing certain, workshops and courses. And as I said, I've seen a whole initiative called public science, in which one of the positions, a tenure track position, is instead of the academy influencing the external world is now starting to influence where the direction the academy is taking. And that's a good thing.
Yes, and in terms of also shaping the movement and the ways that you've done that, I definitely also want to talk about the Black Feminist Archive that you're working on, and we featured it in a recent issue of Ms. in print. The piece also went up online, and I'll link to it in the comments of the video. But can you just speak a little bit to the journey of sort of what led you there, like the inception story, and also where things are at now with the archive?
Absolutely. I would say the main thing is that as an administrator and as I was working for the Ford Foundation and traveling around, I became very conscious of the fact that Black women were under siege, that there were a lot of health issues. Black women were dying. And I kept thinking, what's going to happen to their stuff? And some of us are first generation. And if I, heaven forbid, dropped dead tomorrow, my family would walk into my office now, take one look at all the piles of paper on the floor, because I'm working on multiple projects, right, simultaneously, and they go, oh my goodness, we need to just get rid of this stuff. Well, that stuff is really the essence of history. And history has been written largely through archives. 95% or more of archivists are white. And they get to decide what's important. And what has happened over the years as ethnic studies and multicultural studies and Black studies and women's studies have become more normalized, they go for the stars. So you get the famous people's stuff, but there are people doing tremendous work and great scholarship and who've done research that doesn't always get published, but they've written the articles. I mean, I have grant proposals I've written, I have articles that I've written but never got to publish. And that material tells us something about the life, the full life, the whole life. of who that person was. So I initially went to Spelman, which has the Tony Caidman Barr papers, and at that time, they were really interested in people who had a direct connection to the institution, which is understandable. They have a small space. And so I did a whole call to my alma mater, and I went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, because as I looked at a publication I'd gotten from the library, they had the Du Bois papers there, V.B. Du Bois, and I'd been there when his wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, was there.
Awesome.
They also had the papers of David Levering Lewis, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Du Bois, and then Arlena Botkian, who's one of the founders of Women's Studies there, and I thought, this is some really interesting company. This is a place where people are going to come. I think this would be a good place because they've got a commitment to this kind of diverse scholarship, because you have to understand, Du Bois was a controversial figure. He actually relinquished his citizenship and lived in Ghana. So for them to not only have his papers, but to actually lay in the library after him, which is the tallest building on campus, was quite extraordinary, and that there wasn't any confusion or challenges to that. And I thought, this is a good place, because for lots of changes in leadership, they've maintained that commitment, and that was the kind of commitment I wanted for the Black Feminist Archive. I also wanted to create a legacy. I'm into legacy building, and I think as Black women, we don't do that enough. As I go around and meet Black scholars, Black women, I've talked to one conference where I spoke to 125 Black women law professors, and out of 125, only one had thought about archiving her work, and that was because the library asked her, because she was the first Black dean. 124 women, and the comment that they usually say is, I didn't think my stuff was that important. And yet in these academic fields, in these professional fields, and it is labor. And so I want to build a home for Black women artists, activists especially, because they go out there, they give the speeches, they're organizing people, and then there's nothing about them because they don't have the time to write, or they feel they're not a writer. But they've got all those speeches where they motivated and influenced people. I want to preserve that, the flyers, the posters. So for artists, scholars, activists, whether they consider themselves a feminist or a womanist, or just say, I'm just a Black woman, and hopefully other women of color will see that this is a place where their stuff will be preserved and curated. Outside of Spelman and what I'm doing, there's no place else in the entire world where Black women's work is centered. And that's what I want to do, is to make who we are central and important and significant, and be able to preserve it and make sure that there is a legacy for the next generation and the next generation and the next generation.
I love that. And I'm just, what are some of the coolest stories that you're now able to tell that you're finding in the archives that you have?
Well, just today, I had handed out my card to someone, and she came up to me and said, I was just talking to a gentleman, and they have in a garage full of these papers of this Black woman, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. I said, well, tell them you found a home. And then people will call me up. I have a colleague, a friend, a childhood friend. I've known him since I was in the 5th or 6th grade. And his mother-in-law was a Black wave. She was a Black WAC, I guess, in the military. And at that time, she was there during the segregation period. So he has photographs, and he has letters, and he has material culture. And I said, so she just passed away. And I said, I want to make sure you know there's a place to preserve that. So much of Black history, because of slavery, we weren't allowed to save things and preserve things. And so the material culture that we have today, it's important because it gives us a sense of the lineage. It gives us a sense of the generations of people who came before us, that they did important stuff. They weren't always in the newspaper. We still in some ways operate under the great man thesis, which is that we look for the star people, we look for those people who are out in the public and whose pictures are in the newspaper the most. But there are people who are laying the foundations, who make those people possible, that we never hear about. And so those are the people whose works I want to make sure gets preserved in our country.
Oh, it's amazing. Yes, and I just keep thinking about. I recently went to Casa Azul to Frida Kahlo, so obviously different, but it was, you know, seeing her unfinished paintings,
Yes.
seeing the effects in her home, and you just learn so much about people through their papers. I like clutch my pearls at the thought of someone
Yes.
coming into my office and throwing my stuff out because I'm like, no, that's all mine, you know? And yeah.
And in some ways, the catalyst for this was my own research on Zora. So I've been researching Zora for over a decade. And what I wanted to do was to tell the story of Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist. Well, there's very little evidence of that because Zora, she died in vengeance. So they were actually getting ready to burn her stuff because that's what they did. She was in Fort Pierce, Florida, in a home, and when poor people died, they just threw their stuff in a pile and burned it. And there was a deputy sheriff coming along, and he happened to remember that this woman had written books, and he literally snatched her stuff out of the fires. And those papers, singed papers, are in the University of Florida. And what he did was he took them, he stored them in an old freezer on his porch, and then years later turned them over to the university. So if you go and look at the papers there, they're singed, okay? The other set of her papers are at Yale University, the Beinecke Library. So I went there, and I'm looking for, you know, where are her field notes? Where are the things that tell me about her methodology? And they don't exist. But as I'm looking through the material, I discover these letters from Zora to Langston Hughes. And in her letters, she describes her research. You know, there's a new novel that just came out called Coup de Barraco, and it's about this man who remembers Africa that she was interviewing. Well, she's writing about him in those letters to Langston. So in it, she describes her methodology. So I was able to do two things with that research. One, to dispel the myth around the relationship between Langston and Zora, because it's been constructed, particularly by male historians of the Harlem Renaissance, as a very contentious one. And yet it was actually she would sign her letters, "Dear Langston, love Zora." And she wrote him like every other week in the 1927s when there was no priority mail, there's no express mail, but she's keeping up this ongoing conversation. We don't have his letters back to her because a lot of her stuff got lost, but her letters to him give us such insight into what was the process that she used. Those letters are there because Carl van Vechten, who was a photographer in the 1920s and photographed a lot of Harlem Renaissance people, invited Zora and Langston to turn their papers into the library. So I see myself as following in van Vechten's footsteps and sort of intentionally encouraging people to value their stuff. So what's the prize there? And one of the things is I'm reading this manuscript, you know, and they only let you go in with white gloves, no computers. You can have a computer, but no pens. You have to use pensos, and so it's very, you know, it's very orchestrated and very sort of coordinated. Is that there's a famous line in which Janie's grandmother says, "Black women is the muse of the earth." And you look at that manuscript and you see this insertion, and on the back of this typed manuscript, which Zora typed, is written, you know, or typed this sentence. So you go, oh my God, it didn't just flow out of her head. She had to think about it. It was an afterthought. And so one of the most significant things I find about archives, particularly if they're writers or artists, is that you get to see the process. You know, because often we just see we see the finished form. We see the books, the articles, but what we don't see is how they were playing with words, the decisions they made, those drafts. All of that is the stuff that archives, that to me is the most significant part, is that you begin to understand the process that this person went to get to that finished product. And that is so important and so significant.
Yes, and I think, you know, all of these things shape our understanding of what's happening right now, our understanding of our history, but they also shape our future, the way that we interpret ourselves moving forward. And a question I've been asking all the scholars in my talks with them this week is sort of that the theme of NWSA this year is these radical futures and imagining feminist futures and really visioning and challenging ourselves, I think, to think beyond the world that we are living in right now and more towards this world that we're hopefully building. And I'm just curious, what does your radical future look like? What is your your freedom future look like?
Well, I would say two things. One is I think that as being a member of an oppressed group, where there is no vision, the people perish. And so we always have had to have a vision of who we are and where we want to be in the world, even if we didn't control the circumstances, sometimes of our own bodies. And so for me, the radical imagining is not so radical to me because that's kind of what I've been doing all my life. You know, who would have thought that a girl who's had a second grade education, who's going to drop out of high school and finish high school, same year she did, to go on to become a university president at Shaw, or go on to become a program officer at the Ford Foundation with a $10 million budget, to give money to the things I say are near and dear to my heart: women's studies, Black studies, research, race, class, and gender. Who would have imagined that? It had to be a vision. It had to be a radical imagining. So in many ways, I see this as just, in some ways, making more visible what has been sometimes invisible. And I think our survival has, in fact, depended upon the ability to have that radical imagining. Feminist, non-feminist, but just radical imagining. And so for me, it is just a affirmation of what my life has been about.
Oh, I really love that. And I know that last year at NWSA you were honored, and it's so
For
clear
vision.
why. Yes,
Vision and commitment.
exactly. And your work is just, thank you so much for all that you do and for taking the time to talk to us today. And this is just, it's so powerful.
And this will
amazing.
go in the archive.
Yes, and it lives forever.
Absolutely.
But yeah, thank you so much, Irma.
Well, thank you.
Such a pleasure to work with you. It's such an honor to be able to talk with you, and thank you.
Great. I've enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, and thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll be back.